Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive.
Hi there.
Today we're digging into something pretty heavy. The purges within the Turkish judiciary after the events of July 15th, 2016. We're looking at a key report, plus news and international coverage.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult topic. We're focusing on the huge human impact and the changes to the system itself that these sources describe.
Our aim is really to help you understand the sheer scope and scale, what the sources say happened to the justice system, and crucially, the people involved.
It's tough material, no doubt, but hopefully we can walk you through what the sources found.
So let's start right after the events. July 16th, 2016. What did the sources tell us?
Well, the first thing that jumps out is just the incredible speed and scale. The very next day, July 16th, sources report 2,745 judges and prosecutors were detained.
A day after. Wow. And the sources highlight this was even before many of the alleged military members involved were picked up.
Exactly. That timing, according to these reports, really raises a big question. How could lists of specific judges and prosecutors be ready and acted on so fast? It suggests, well, maybe pre-prepared plans.
Which leads straight into the state of emergency being declared.
Yes, the OHAIL, as it was known. And this state of emergency paved the way for using emergency decrees, the KHKs.
Right, the decrees.
And sources point to examples like Decree KHK 66, showing how these basically allowed the government to bypass normal constitutional protections and the standard disciplinary rules for judges and prosecutors. Huge power.
And the sources really question this, don't they? Was that kind of sweeping power necessary, and what did it cost the rule of law?
The most immediate visible consequence documented was just mass dismissals. Across the board in public service, we're talking over 130,000 officials removed.
130,000, it's staggering. And reports suggest it was often just, names on lists attached to these decrees. Like KHK 672 apparently dismissed over 40,000 people in one go.
And if we focus on the judiciary, the Council of Judges and Prosecutors, the HSK, that's the body overseeing judges, they dismissed 2,847 judges and prosecutors in a single decision. That was August 2016.
Wow.
And the total number of judicial dismissals documented reached about 4,500.
And a recurring theme in the sources is that these were just lists of names. People often didn't get a chance to defend themselves, which again fuels that suspicion about pre-existing lists and their accuracy.
Looking bigger picture, government figures released later, like in 2023, early 2024, suggested almost 700,000 people ended up facing legal proceedings somehow linked to the movement the government blames, which they call FITO.
700,000 proceedings.
Yeah, with over 122,000 convicted, thousands still in prison years later, and reports of ongoing operations too.
That scale is just immense. The official reason given in the sources was always an alleged link to this movement, often tied back to those 2013 corruption probes that the government later described as an attempted coup by the same movement.
That was the justification presented. But the central question that keeps coming up in the sources we looked at is, where was the solid individual evidence for each person dismissed or detained? Reports strongly suggest it often just wasn't there.
And alongside this, sources track a real erosion of judicial independence. Changes to the structure of the HSK, the Judicial Council, seem to have made it more open to government influence.
And then you had this huge influx, around 15,000 new judges and prosecutors hired. Sources describe the hiring process, the exams and interviews, as politicized, which naturally raises questions about, their qualifications and how independent they really were.
The sources also note a change in how things were talked about. Some commentators started calling Turkey a regime state, and there were reports of courts seemingly ignoring human rights abuses, maybe fostering a sense of impunity.
And what's really disturbing is how anti-terrorism laws were reportedly used. Judges and prosecutors themselves were branded terrorists, sometimes on grounds that seem, quite flimsy, according to the reports.
Like just belonging to a particular judicial association, Yarsav. Or even how they voted in past elections for the HSK, the rhetoric described sounds incredibly harsh.
Which brings us to the truly devastating human cost documented in these sources. Reports explicitly link suicides in prisons to the conditions, the pressure, maybe alleged torture.
The numbers are chilling.
Yeah, figures mentioned include 66 reported suicides in prisons just in 2016. Other reports track dozens more deaths among those dismissed or detained in the months following July 2016.
And the individual stories recounted are just heartbreaking. A member of the Supreme Court of Appeals, that's the Yargıtay, reportedly denied release for a brain tumor, dying shortly after finally being let go. A former member of the HSK died in prison. Another Supreme Court judge with health issues died in prison. The European Court of Human Rights later ruled his detention unlawful.
And then the stories of people trying to flee. A judge and a candidate judge, a prosecutor and his wife. Sources say they drowned trying to escape the country.
Just awful.
And beyond deaths, the sources detail really disturbing accounts of torture and ill treatment in detention. Severe overcrowding, denial of basic needs like water or medicine, beatings, threats against families, humiliation, solitary confinement. There are specific accounts, like letters smuggled out or testimony about alleged torture by named officers.
And even for those not detained or eventually released, the sources talk about this concept of civil death.
Yeah, basically being completely excluded from public life, making it incredibly difficult to find any work. Reports mention specific codes used by the Social Security Institution, the SGK, that essentially flag dismiss people to potential employers like a blacklist.
Plus frozen bank accounts, revoked passports, and even if you were a judge or prosecutor, getting back into practicing law was made systematically difficult.
Now, the international community wasn't silent on this, the sources show.
No, there was a reaction.
The European Court of Human Rights, the ECTHR, made some pretty significant rulings. Cases like Alparslan Altan versus Turkey, Hakan Baş versus Turkey, these found rights violations in the mass arrests. And the Yeltsin versus Turkey case specifically addressed violations in trials linked to the alleged movement.
And other bodies, like the Venice Commission, the Council of Europe, they also criticized the lack of transparency, the use of these decrees without proper individual checks.
But, back in Turkey, the sources suggest domestic legal remedies often failed. Apparently, the Constitutional Court initially refused even to review the emergency decrees, changing its own previous stance, and later mostly sided with the government line.
And the higher courts, the Supreme Court of Appeals, the Yargıtay, and the Council of State,
often upheld the dismissals, seemingly relying more on the government's narrative than on established legal principles, according to the analysis in the sources.
And reports indicate that even those major rulings from the European Court of Human Rights often weren't implemented domestically, reinforcing this pattern described in the sources of disregarding rule of law principles.
So the overall picture painted by these sources is one of a pervasive climate of fear, the judiciary itself appearing to be used against perceived dissent. There was that chilling phrase mentioned in reports that became kind of symbolic: prison is cold.
And you see it reflected in the numbers, too. International measures of rule of law showed Turkey's rankings just plummeting during this period, a significant regression.
Reading through these sources, you're really left with this profound sense of, well, sadness and confusion. People whose job it was to uphold justice judges, prosecutors finding themselves, according to these accounts, victims of severe human rights violations.
The findings documented are truly tragic, an immense human cost, and what the sources describe as a fundamental erosion of the rule of law. It really demands serious thought from anyone who cares about justice.
And perhaps it leaves you, the listener, thinking about this. What are the long-term consequences for a whole society when its justice system is altered so drastically and seemingly used in this way?
And what's the responsibility, both inside the country and internationally, to address the issues documented in these sources and maybe work to prevent anything similar happening again? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.